At your age, an assisted living facility is really for the best. Mom, Garrett muttered. The living room smelled of fresh pine and Sloane's overly expensive perfume. Garrett stood holding a flute of champagne in front of the massive Christmas tree they had picked out themselves. The house, my house, was packed with their guests. Sloane stood beside him, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, looking at me like I was an old piece of furniture they were finally dragging to the curb. You've already lost the house. Meredith, just accept it. Sloane chimed in, crossing her arms and not even trying to hide her disdain. We signed the paperwork. It's time for you to go. They expected me to crumble. They wanted the screaming, the tears, or for me to fall to my knees begging to keep my own home, the one I had built 30 years ago. Instead, a strange, razor-sharp calm washed over my chest. I looked at both of them, and then at Sloane's group of friends who were pretending not to eavesdrop from the dining room. I kept my posture perfectly straight, holding onto my mug of chamomile tea. I just smiled. A brief, almost imperceptible smile. Are you sure about that, Garrett? I replied softly. To understand how we ended up here, standing under the blinking lights of a Christmas tree, you have to rewind 2 years. Garrett and Sloane had moved in with me temporarily because the rent on their downtown apartment had gotten ridiculous. I was a widow. The house was big, and like any mother, I thought I could help my son get back on his feet, but the months ticked by, and that stability never materialized. What arrived instead was an invasion. First, it was Sloane's furniture replacing mine in the living room. Then came the dinner parties where I cooked the meals, and they invited their friends, leaving me with a sink full of dirty dishes. Sloane didn't work. She claimed she was holding out for the right career opportunity. Meanwhile, the mountain of online shopping boxes never stopped piling up on the front porch. I'm not a woman who engages in loud, dramatic confrontations. I've always believed that respect is shown through actions. But when their actions proved they had turned me into a voiceless maid in my own home, I knew my patience had an expiration date, and they were about to cross the line. The reality of their situation first started showing up in the mail. Every morning, I was the first one out to the mailbox, sandwiched between the water and electric bills. Bright pink and yellow envelopes addressed to Sloane began to appear. Final notices from collection agencies. I would leave them lined up perfectly on the dining room table. Sloane would snatch them up quickly, muttering flimsy excuses about banking errors. But the tension in the house was thickening. Garrett started working later and later, coming home with deep circles under his eyes and a permanent scowl. One afternoon in November, Garrett walked into the kitchen while I was simmering some soup. He sat at the table, aggressively rubbing his temples. Mom, I need to ask you a massive favor. He started, unable to meet my eyes. Sloane had a hiccup with her credit cards. The interest rates are drowning us. We need a loan. Just to cover this, I swear I'll pay you back. I turned off the burner, dried my hands on a dish towel, and sat down across from him. No, Garrett, I answered. My tone was firm, though my voice never rose. He snapped his head up, genuinely shocked. He was so used to my silence that he must have assumed my bank account was his personal slush fund. What do you mean? No, it's an emergency. You have Dad's savings. We're family, he demanded, slamming his hand lightly on the table. Your father's money is for my retirement, so I never have to become a burden to anyone. It's not here to bail you out of a lifestyle your wife can't afford. I told him plainly. Garrett shot up from his chair, red-faced and furious. He accused me of being selfish, of actively trying to sabotage his marriage. Sloane, who had been eavesdropping in the hallway, marched into the kitchen with a defiant glare. "If you aren't going to help us, the least you could do is get out of our way." She spat. That night, it hit me I wasn't a mother to them. I was an ATM. And when the ATM stopped dispensing cash, I became the enemy. I didn't cry. I didn't lock myself in my room to wallow. If they wanted to live like hostile strangers under my roof, we were going to change the rules of the game. From that second on, the bank of Mom was permanently closed. If there was one thing Sloane loved more than spending money, it was keeping up appearances. She loved opening the fridge to find imported cheeses, prosciutto, and good wine, all bankrolled by my weekly grocery runs. That ended the morning after our fight. I went to the grocery store and bought exactly what I needed for myself: some chicken, fresh produce, fruit, and my coffee. I claimed a single shelf for my things and left the rest of the refrigerator completely bare. When Sloane wandered downstairs mid-morning to make breakfast, I heard the loud thud of the fridge door shutting. "Where's all the food?" "Meredith," she yelled from the kitchen. I was sitting in the living room, reading the morning paper. I didn't even look up. "At the grocery store, I imagine." "I already did my shopping." I called back. Sloane's heavy footsteps echoed down the hall until she was standing right in front of me, looking indignant. "Are we just supposed to starve Garrett Works all day? I expect 2 grown adults in their 30s to handle their own groceries." I casually turned the page of the paper. "You already get free rent and utilities. Food is on you." Sloane let out a loud huff and stomped back to her room, slamming the door. I knew her credit cards were maxed out, and Garrett was barely scraping by, just paying the minimums. For the next 2 weeks, the tension in the house was suffocating. They survived on cheap sandwiches and instant ramen while I cooked myself balanced, healthy dinners. I never offered them a bite, and they never asked, but the lack of cash was making Sloane desperate. One afternoon, while I was out back watering the patio plants, I heard her talking on her cell phone on the second-floor balcony. Her voice was a nervous, hushed whisper. "I'm telling you, Garrett already has a plan. We just need a few more weeks to get the cash advance. The old bat isn't going to realize a thing until it's way too late." I kept watering my ferns. My heart rate didn't even spike. I simply turned off the hose, dried my hands, and realized it was time to start paying very close attention to my son's next move. Garrett's plan didn't take long to rear its ugly head. On a Tuesday morning, when he thought I was out at my knitting group, I came home early fighting a cold. As I walked in through the back door, I heard men's voices coming from the dining room. I froze in the kitchen hallway. Garrett was standing there with an older man in a cheap suit who carried himself with a sleazy, arrogant swagger. As you can see, Vince, it's got great bones. The layout is spacious. Garrett was pitching. "My mother is moving into a home soon, so the place will be completely empty and ready to go by January." "I like it," Vince replied. He was a notorious local hard money lender known for sketchy, off-the-books real estate flips. "But remember, this is a cash deal, strictly under the table for now. I'll give you a 40% advance today. We sign a private promissory note, and you get the rest in January when you hand over the keys. You flake on me, you owe me double." My son was selling the house. My house. I waited for them to step out into the backyard before slipping upstairs to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, taking a slow, deep breath. Garrett didn't have the deed, but he knew I kept an old, expired power of attorney in my desk from when I had a major surgery years ago. Armed with that, and a fraudulent private contract, he was pulling cash from a dangerous man to pay off Sloane's debts. Their grand plan was to pocket the advance, blindside me on Christmas by claiming the house was sold, and kick me to the curb or dump me in the cheapest nursing home they could find. Anyone else would have run downstairs screaming, making a massive scene in front of Vince. Not me. Throwing a fit would only put Garrett on the defensive and give him time to hide the money. I stood up slowly and walked over to my desk. Sure enough, my document files were slightly out of order. I smiled bitterly. They had severely underestimated my intelligence. That very afternoon, I began executing my own exit strategy. The next morning, I left the house at my usual time, but I didn't go to my knitting group. I went straight to my bank. I withdrew every single penny from the joint emergency account I shared with Garrett and transferred it all into a brand new account in my name only. Next, I pulled the original deed to the house from my safety deposit box and tucked it safely into my purse. My next stop was a quiet, leafy neighborhood across town. I found a beautiful little ground floor apartment with a modest garden and gorgeous natural light. It was absolutely perfect. I wrote a check for 6 months' rent up front and walked out with the keys in my hand. The real work started when I got home. I couldn't drag out large suitcases or move furniture without tipping off Sloan. So, I started quietly packing up my entire life into canvas grocery totes and my oversized knitting bag. Day by day, I smuggled out the family photo albums, my jewelry, my favorite china, and the books that actually meant something to me. I packed everything right under their noses, using the excuse of dropping off dry cleaning or taking donations to the church. I'd drive over to my new apartment, unload my things, and return home with an empty bag. On the surface, life went on as usual. I kept roasting my chicken, watering my plants, and reading on the sofa. Sloan would walk past me with her nose in the air, completely ignoring me, glued to her online shopping catalogs. I knew they had received Vince's cash advance because Sloan suddenly started coming home with shopping bags from high-end boutiques. She had paid off her debts and still had plenty left over to celebrate. They looked at me and just saw a ghost haunting my own living room, a clueless old woman who would soon be out of their hair. They had no idea that behind my bedroom door, my closets were completely bare. All I had left was the outfit on my back and a couple changes of clothes. I was already gone. Only my body was left behind. Waiting for the perfect moment, December arrived, and the house underwent a complete transformation. Sloan hired professional decorators to set up a towering Christmas tree in the living room, drowning in crystal ornaments and twinkling lights. She bought outrageously expensive garlands and covered the dining table in lush floral centerpieces. She strutted around playing the lady of the manor, fueled by an artificial authority bought with my son's stolen money. One afternoon, she cornered me in the hallway. She had a clipboard in her hand and a sickeningly sweet, condescending tone. "Meredith, Garrett and I have decided to throw a massive Christmas Eve party. We're inviting all our friends. We want the place looking absolutely flawless. So I'm going to have to ask you not to leave your knitting supplies in the living room," she said, looking me up and down. "Also, we need to talk about your plans for January. We found a lovely little facility for you, with nurses and people your own age." I looked right through her. There wasn't an ounce of compassion in her eyes, just the cold, calculated smugness of someone who thought they had just won a game of chess. "My plans for January are completely sorted out, Sloan. You don't need to worry about a thing," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. She beamed, clearly assuming I had finally accepted defeat. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. It really is for the best." As she sashayed away to continue planning her victory lap, I walked into the kitchen and pulled out the utility bills. Days earlier, I had filed the paperwork to cut off the water, gas, and electricity in my name. If they wanted the lights on in January, they'd have to set up new accounts themselves. All my loose ends were tied. My new apartment was fully furnished, warm, and waiting for me. Sloane's party was fast approaching. She kept buying imported foods, vintage champagne, and expensive gifts, burning through the very last drops of Vince's cash. I watched it all in total silence, sipping my coffee, knowing their house of cards was about to violently collapse and knowing I wasn't going to lift a single finger to catch them. December 24th was bitterly cold. I woke up early in my old bedroom and looked at the walls one last time. There was a twinge of nostalgia. Sure, I had raised Garrett here. I had shared decades of marriage here. But a house isn't a home when it's filled with people who view you as an obstacle. A real home is wherever you have peace. And my peace was waiting for me across town. By 5 p.m., the house was pure chaos. Garrett was rushing back and forth, hauling boxes of liquor, sweating through his shirt, his nerves clearly shot. Maybe the guilt of throwing his mother onto the street on Christmas Eve was eating at him. Or maybe it was just the stress of the lie. Sloane, on the other hand, was glowing in a designer dress, barking orders at the hired waitstaff. I dressed in a simple, elegant pantsuit. I tucked my final belongings, my toothbrush, my medications, and my vital documents into my handbag and left it on the bed, ready to go. When I finally walked downstairs, the guests were already pouring in. They were Sloane's crowd, loud people who drank too fast and laughed too hard. They gave me polite, pitying nods before immediately ignoring me. I took a seat in a single armchair near the hallway, watching the whole circus play out like a movie where I already knew the twist ending. At 10 p.m., Garrett stood by the fireplace and clinked a fork against his champagne glass. The music faded out. Sloane sidled up next to him, wrapping an arm around his waist. Every eye in the room turned to the happy couple. "I want to thank you all so much for being here tonight." Garrett started, his voice wavering just a fraction. "This year has brought a lot of changes for us. And tonight, we want to celebrate a new beginning." He cleared his throat, and his eyes darted across the room until they locked onto mine. The moment they had spent months orchestrating had finally arrived. "We want to officially announce that. As of today, this house is officially and entirely ours," Garrett declared, projecting his voice so everyone could hear. "My mother, Meredith, will be starting a brand new chapter at a wonderful assisted living facility. We really believe that, at her age, it's what's best." A scattered, awkward applause rippled through the guests. Most of them glanced at me with a mix of pity and deep discomfort. Sloane looked positively triumphant. Garrett handed off his glass and walked straight over to my chair as the crowd parted for him. "You've already lost the house. Mom, we signed a private contract and took the advance. Just accept it," he whispered, his voice low enough that only I could hear, laced with a cruel finality. "We'll pack your room up tomorrow." I didn't stand up. I didn't panic. I took a slow sip of my tea, locked eyes with him, and finally dropped the hammer. "Are you sure about that, Garrett?" I asked, with a chilling calmness that immediately threw him off balance. Sloane, who had followed close behind him, let out a dry, condescending laugh. "Don't make a scene. Meredith, the paperwork is signed. The buyer already paid. You're out of options." "I haven't signed a single thing, Sloane," I replied, settling deeper into my chair. "That power of attorney Garrett used expired 3 years ago. And the original deed isn't in the drawer he thought it was." All the color instantly drained from my son's face. He opened his mouth to speak, but the loud, aggressive buzzing of the front doorbell cut him off. Garrett swallowed hard. I stood up slowly, smoothed out my slacks, and walked straight to the foyer. "That must be our missing guest," I said, pulling the heavy oak door wide open. Standing on the porch wasn't a friend holding a bottle of wine. It was Vince, the loan shark, flanked by two incredibly large, mean-looking men. His face was beet red with absolute fury, and he had a manila folder gripped tightly in his fist. The entire party suddenly went dead silent. Before anyone could move, the doorbell rang loud, harsh, and persistent, cutting through the silence like a knife. Carlos frozen. Sloane's hand, reaching for her glass, stopped in midair. The entire room held its breath. I stood up slowly and walked to the front door. "That must be our missing guest," I said, my voice smooth and deadly calm. I opened the door wide. It wasn't a party guest with presents. It was Don Arturo, the private lender from the neighborhood, backed by two towering men. His face was beet red, and he clutched a leather folder. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped past me, his eyes locking onto Carlos, who had practically bumped into the massive Christmas tree as he tried to back away. "Good evening, Carlos." Arturo growled, almost spitting the words. "I went to the county clerk's office early this morning to do my own due diligence before handing over the rest of the money tomorrow. They had some interesting news." Carlos was shaking, breaking into a visible sweat. Sloane just stared, her mouth slightly agape, unable to grasp the magnitude of the storm that was hitting them. "You showed me a power of attorney, kid," Arturo continued, stepping closer. "But it turns out that document isn't worth the paper it's printed on." "Don Arturo, please, we can explain." Carlos stammered. "My mother, she's going to sign. I am not signing anything." I interrupted, taking a single step forward. I pulled the copy of my own deed from my handbag, the fresh official seal gleaming. "This house is mine, sir. Completely mine. My son used fake documents. Your issue is strictly with him and his wife." Arturo took the copy I offered, glancing at it before pinning Carlos with a gaze that promised pure hell. "He swindled me. I gave him 40% in cash up front," Arturo said, his voice dropping an octave. "I want my money back. Now." "We don't have it," Sloane shrieked, losing all composure. We paid off her debts. We bought the decorations. Arturo, crossing his massive arms, blocking the escape. "That's your problem, not mine. You have 48 hours to return every single cent, or this house won't be the only thing you're losing." Sloane's champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. The guests were already silently filtering towards the exit, desperate to escape the blast zone. Carlos dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands, finally trapped in the very hole he had dug for me. I watched them both for another moment, the panicked weeping of the wife, the utter despair of the son. The trap had closed, but I was on the other side of the door. I walked calmly past the chaos. I went up to my bedroom one last time, grabbed my purse from the bed, slipped on my wool coat, and walked back downstairs. Don Arturo was now demanding to see their bank statements, and Sloane was crying hysterically into her hands. I paused at the entryway. I pulled my old set of house keys off my keychain and left them on the console table with a soft, final, metallic clink. Carlos looked up, eyes brimming with tears, a desperate, final plea in his gaze. Mom, please, help me. Don't let them do this. You have savings. Please." I looked at him, my only son, who had been willing to sell his mother for a fresh start. I felt no rage, but no pity either. The damage was done. "You're an adult, Carlos," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Decisions have consequences. Survive yours." I didn't wait for a reply. I walked out the front door, into the cold, night air. I climbed into my car, turned the key, and drove away from the home I had lived in for 30 years. I never looked in the rearview mirror. When I arrived at my new apartment, the quiet scent of lavender and the absolute peace of the place wrapped around me like a hug. All my truly important things, my books, my photos, my dignity were safe and waiting. I made a cup of chamomile tea, stepped out onto the small balcony, and watched the city lights. Completely serene. I was safe. And for the first time in years, I was truly free.